The piano had long gone quiet in Barty Thorne's saloon, though its keys still bore the smudges of desperate hands and spilled whiskey. In the lamplight haze, the place smelled of old cigars and men who hadn't prayed in years. There was laughter, sure, but it was the kind that cut, not the kind that healed. Owen Croft stepped through the saloon doors, not looking for women, nor whiskey, nor company. He'd come to settle a grain delivery, to nod his head, take his coin, and vanish back to the silence of his homestead. That was all. The evening had pressed down with the weight of ghosts, and he hadn't spoken a word since breakfast. But then he saw them. 3 figures lined up near the bar's back wall, half lit like ghosts at judgment. They were Chinese, their simple, dark tunics a stark contrast to the gaudy dresses of the other women in the room. The first was young, couldn't have been more than 19, her small frame lost in clothes made for another. Her arms were burned, small, blistered welts like she'd leaned over too many hot stoves. She stared at her own worn slippers like they'd speak before she ever would. Next to her stood a broad-shouldered woman with hair pulled back in a severe, practical knot, arms folded like a soldier guarding her own hurt. The fabric of her tunic strained at the seams, and the men laughed when they saw her strength. But she did not laugh. She stared at the floorboards like she was memorizing every knot in the wood. And then the last woman. She stood like she didn't belong there at all. She held her chin high, the left side of her face in shadow. But when she turned, Owen saw it. A puckered, pale scar marred her cheek, a ghost of some past violence. The rest of her was composed, proud, with the straightness of spine that spoke of an education and a life before this. She didn't look away from any man in the room. They were not speaking. They were not smiling. They were waiting. He knew this wasn't a dance and this wasn't marriage. This was shame being sold by the hour. Barty Thorne, the saloon keeper, was wiping a mug with a dirty rag and calling out bids like he was selling cattle. "Who will start us off for this one?" he sneered, gesturing to the youngest. "A bit shy but she'll warm to kindness," someone laughed. Another voice offered half a jug of rye for a night's favor. The crowd roared. Owen didn't move. His boots remained planted in the sawdust. But something in him went cold. A memory rose. His wife Martha before the wasting sickness, before she bled out alone while the doctor took too long. She'd been rejected by 3 suitors before him, told she was too skinny, too plain, too serious. He'd loved her for every one of those reasons. Now, here were 3 women with labels stitched to their backs like crimes, amplified by the foreignness the town feared. The youngest, flinched when a man reached toward her face just to check her teeth as he joked. Owen stepped forward then, silent as fog. He didn't look at the men. He looked only at Thorne and said, calm and low, "I'll take all 3. The laughter paused. Someone coughed. Thorne blinked. "All 3? You drunk already, Croft?" Owen reached inside his coat and laid down a handful of coins. Clean silver. Hard-earned. The kind that didn't make noise when it hit the bar. It just sat there, solid like a promise. "They're not cattle, Barty," he said. "They'll come with me." One of the men, young, red-faced, angry at the silence, spat near Owen's boots. "What are you planning, Croft? Build your own little Orient." Owen didn't answer. He just stepped to the side and opened the saloon door. The storm hadn't started, but the air outside was thick with the promise of rain. For a second, no one moved. Then the proud one, the one with the scar, stepped out first. She didn't look at Owen, only past him like a wind through dry grass. The broad-shouldered woman followed. And lastly, the girl, still clutching her burned arms, stumbled forward like she was waiting for someone to stop her. No one did. They vanished into the night, their dark clothes swallowed by the darkness. Owen walked them to his wagon in silence. The horses stomped restlessly, unsure what was changing, only that something was. None of the women asked where they were going. He didn't offer. The ride was long and quiet. The girl fell asleep against the sideboard. Lee, the strong one, sat upright, staring into the dark like it owed her something. Mai Ling, the one with the scar, kept her hands folded in her lap as if in prayer. The moon broke through once, pale and crooked. Owen glanced back at them. 3 women, all discarded, all stronger than they looked, and he didn't know if he was saving them or if they were saving him. The cabin appeared just before dawn, plain, wooden, with shutters loose and porch steps worn smooth. A lantern burned in the window, faint and flickering. Owen helped no one down. He only unlocked the door and stepped aside. "It ain't much," he said, "but it's clean." Inside there was a hearth, 2 cots, and 1 long rug that had once been his wife's. Dust clung to the beams. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was waiting. Mai Ling took the cot closest to the window. Lee sat on the rug and stretched her back with a groan. And stood by the door, not sure whether she belonged inside or not. Owen fetched water and bread and left it on the table. He didn't say goodnight, just took his hat off, nodded once, and stepped outside. He sat on the porch, the cold wind brushing his jaw. Behind him, a chair creaked. Mai Ling had joined him. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The horizon bled into soft grey. Morning was beginning, and with it, something else. He didn't know the word for it yet, but it felt like hope. The sun rose quietly that morning, slipping over the hills like it too was uncertain whether it belonged. Its light fell across the weathered front porch of Owen Croft's homestead, where 3 simple tunics hung damp from the night fog, each one breathing steam into the chilled dawn. No one had spoken since they arrived. No introductions, no questions. Only the creak of floorboards and the sound of a fire coaxed to life before the sky had turned full gold. And was the first to move. She stepped barefoot into the kitchen, a borrowed nightgown clinging to her small frame, hair still pinned in the tight bun someone else had fashioned. Her arms, scarred and faded, peeked out as she reached for a pan that looked heavier than her wrists could bear. She moved without noise out of habit, not stealth. Owen watched her from the barn window as she cracked 2 eggs and stirred them without seasoning, as if expecting someone to take the spoon from her hands before she could finish. Lee rose with a sigh that sounded of cracking joints. She pulled her hair back with twine and stepped outside, ignoring the cold. She found the axe and began chopping firewood. Each strike was clean, precise, deliberate. The sleeves of her borrowed shirt strained across her back, but she didn't stop. When Owen approached, she didn't look up. She only said, "This fence of yours leans like it's given up," and went on splitting logs until sweat glazed her brow. Mai Ling remained inside, her tunic from the night before folded neatly by the window. She wore a faded green blouse and a skirt 1 size too short, the hem brushing her calves like it remembered a different woman's legs. She was standing in front of a cracked mirror, brushing her hair methodically, every stroke the same length. Her scarred cheek was visible in the reflection, and she stared back at it unflinching. Owen leaned against the door frame and cleared his throat. Mai Ling met his gaze through the mirror. "You ain't got to do anything," he said. "Not unless you want to." Her voice was soft but firm. "Idle hands get gossiped about." He said nothing more. The house already felt different. It had once been a monument to absence. His wife's shawl still folded on the mantel, a child's wooden toy tucked under the bed. Now there was movement, quiet as it was. The kettle hissed. A broom whispered across the floor. A brief, sharp sound came from the yard. Lee had broken the axe handle. "Damn it," she muttered, half grinning, then winced as a splinter jabbed her thumb. And rushed out with a cloth, but Lee waved her off. "I've bled worse in kitchens back in San Francisco." Still, she let the girl bind it. Anne's hands trembled slightly, but Lee didn't flinch. Behind them, Owen finished mending the fence boards 1 nail at a time, the hammer tapping like distant hoof beats. By midday, they had settled into a rhythm not unlike a truce. Mai Ling cleaned the shelves, dusted the windows, and read from a tattered book in the afternoons. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words carried weight. And baked flatbread in silence, humming tunelessly, lost in repetition. Lee dragged buckets of water from the well and patched roof tiles, stubborn in her usefulness. She worked like she was proving someone wrong. The townsfolk, however, were less quiet. By evening, Agnes Reed had arrived at the ranch. She brought no basket, no excuse, just her wrinkled shawl and a look that had seen too many winters. "You know they're talking," she said to Owen, who stood on the porch oiling a lantern. "Calling you all kinds of fool, saying you bought yourself a stable of foreign mares, one for each sin." Owen didn't look up. "Let them talk." Agnes narrowed her eyes. "You got plans for them girls, Croft?" "I got space," he said simply. They needed it. Agnes studied him for a long moment, then turned her gaze to the figures inside. "Lee's the strong one. Cracked a foreman's jaw once on the railroad line. And's not from here. Some cook's daughter sold to pay a debt, I think. And Myling, she used to be a tutor until some fool's wife threw lie in her face. Called her a heathen for knowing poetry." Owen's jaw twitched. "And yet the town still points at them, not the ones who did it." Agnes snorted. "You think the wind don't carry old sins just because they're quiet? You're either their savior, Owen, or their next mistake." He met her eyes. "I'm not either." That night, Anne placed bread and soup on the table. She didn't sit. Lee brought a chair from the porch and dropped into it with a grunt, nodding once. Myling waited until Owen took the first bite before she lifted her spoon. No one said grace, but there was a stillness in the room that felt like reverence. "Do you plan to marry any of us?" Myling asked suddenly. Owen paused mid-bite. No, and looked down at her lap. "Good," Myling said. "We didn't come here to replace ghosts." "No," he agreed. "You came here to get away from men like Thorn." "That's enough." For a moment, no one moved. Then Lee leaned back in her chair, tilted it on two legs, and said, "Well, long as we know where the lines are, I suppose we'll all sleep easier." Outside, the wind picked up. Owen stepped onto the porch again. Lee followed with a broken piece of fence wood and a carving knife. She sat on the steps and began to whittle without comment. "You don't trust Easy," Owen said. Lee snorted. "You do." He looked toward the moon, pale and distant. "Did once," she carved in silence. "Then you think you're saving us. But maybe you're just lonely and I am," he said. "That don't mean I'm wrong." The moon shifted behind a cloud. The cold deepened. "You know," Lee said, voice lower now, "I grew up thinking I'd marry some blacksmith or farmer. Didn't count on being told I was too strong, too stubborn, not like our women should be. They meant it like an insult, but I held onto it like a badge." Owen turned to her. "Maybe you weren't too much. Maybe they were too little." She looked at him then, full on, her eyes catching the lantern light. "Maybe." Inside, and watched from the window, face half-lit, one hand resting against the glass like she was remembering something. Myling was reading again, aloud this time, to no one in particular, her voice soft, steady, full of rhythm. The book was worn, and the page she lingered on mentioned redemption. Later, Owen would sit alone by the fire, listening to the house breathe. He would not yet know their stories, not fully, but he could feel them unfolding like seeds warming in the earth. They weren't his brides. They weren't his burden. They were people, shadows, yes, but not ones he feared. He remembered something his mother once said long before her voice faded from memory. "You don't need to fix the whole world, Owen, just give someone a place to rest a while." And here in a house that had once known only silence and sorrow, 3 women began to breathe again. Not because he saved them, but because he didn't try to own them. And that, in the end, made all the difference. The wind changed on the 3rd day. It came in low and dry from the canyon, brushing across the ranch like a stranger come to test the strength of doors and bones alike. The morning started as any other, and tending to the hens, Lee sharpening tools, Myling reading beside the window, tracing every word with her finger like she was relearning the rhythm of language. Owen watched them from a distance, careful not to press too close. But something had shifted. There was a tension now woven into the air like a thread pulling tight. That afternoon, Anne dropped a plate when she heard footsteps near the gate. Her hands flew to her chest as if to hold her ribs in place, her eyes wide and far away. The others ran in at the sound, but she shook her head before they could speak. It was nothing, she whispered. Just the wind. It wasn't. A man had come riding down the path. Not a lawman, not a neighbor. Owen recognized him from the saloon. A thick-shouldered brute with a sneer that didn't move when he smiled. His name was Gideon Cole, a ranch hand who had drunk too much the night of the auction and placed a mock bid on Lee. He hadn't been laughed out for it, he'd left on his own, red-faced and snarling. Now he stood at the edge of Owen's land, hand on his belt, waiting like the land owed him something. Owen stepped down from the porch. "You're not welcome here," Gideon spat in the dirt. "Ain't here for you, you won't get past me, I got a claim," Gideon said, his voice oily. Paid for her fair and square. Lee stepped out then, barefoot, face streaked with dust and sweat. She stood beside Owen but didn't speak. Her hands were steady, her gaze fixed. "You got nothing," she said. "You offered a bottle of rye and a joke." "That ain't a claim," Gideon smirked. "You think you're too good for me now?" "I was always too good for you," she said, quiet as thunder. Gideon shifted his stance as if readying for something, but Owen didn't move, just stood with arms loose at his side, eyes steady. That's when Gideon noticed the rifle resting against the porch post, uncocked, untouched, but present. "You can ride off," Owen said, "or you can limp off. But either way, you're leaving." Gideon laughed once, sharp and mean, then turned his horse. He didn't ride fast. Men like him never did. They wanted you to know they might come back. The silence that followed was thick. Lee didn't flinch. She walked back inside, poured a glass of water, and sat at the table. And waited until nightfall to ask, what happens when the next man comes? No one answered. That night, they all stayed closer to the fire. Lee sharpened the same knife over and over. Myling pretended to read, but never turned the page. And kept glancing toward the door. Owen sat with his back to the window watching the shadows move. Later, after the others had gone to bed, he found Lee sitting out by the barn. "You did good today," he said. She shrugged. "I didn't do nothing, you stood your ground." She looked up at the sky. "It never ends, does it? The proving, the fending off, even when you've done everything right." Owen didn't answer. Instead, he sat beside her, both of them facing the prairie as if waiting for it to offer something back. "I've got nothing but this land," he said after a long silence. "It's all I know. I plant things, fix things, keep things going. I don't know how to fix people. You're not supposed to," she said. "Just don't break us more." He nodded slowly. That was all she wanted. No miracles, no mending, just no more hurt. By morning, Myling had decided to teach again. The neighbor's boy, Simon, had knocked with a sheepish grin and a book in his hand. "Pa says I can't read for beans, and Ma says you used to be real smart." Myling had blinked, stunned. But she invited him in and took the book, her hand trembling slightly. For the first time, she didn't sit by the window. She sat at the table, her gaze softened by sunlight. She didn't smile much, but that morning, she did. Just once. Owen saw it. And surprised them all. She asked to go into town. No one pushed her, but when she said it, she stood taller, like it mattered. "Just for sugar," she added quickly. Maybe flour." Lee offered to go with her. Myling said she'd write a list. Owen told them to be back before sundown, but said, "I want to go alone," so she did. She wore a scarf and a grey shawl. She kept her hands in her sleeves, but she walked with purpose. And though her fingers shook when she handed the coin to the grocer, she looked him in the eye. People stared. They always did. Some whispered. Some crossed the street. Agnes Reed, sweeping her porch, simply nodded. And nodded back. She returned before the sky turned gold. Owen was mending tack in the barn. She walked straight to him and held out the sack of flour. He didn't say anything, just took it and handed her a folded napkin. "What's this?" she asked. "Apple jam." "You forgot it." She blinked, tears catching her lower lashes. "I didn't mean to cry," she said softly. "I know. The next few days passed without storm, but with a quiet change. Simon returned for lessons. Lee repaired the hinges on the pantry door without being asked. Myling began humming again and planted seeds in a window-sill box. Basil, thyme, a few mystery sprouts she'd saved from old kitchens. The ranch began to resemble something like a home. Not perfect, not whole, but breathing. Then came the sheriff. He arrived one morning, boots thick with red dust, hat too clean for a man who claimed to know struggle. Owen met him at the gate. "Words come from Thorn," Sheriff Brody said. "Says there's some legal issue with your guests. Thorn sold what wasn't his," Owen replied. "Maybe," the sheriff allowed. "But the town's uneasy. Reverend Miller says it ain't natural. 3 foreign women, unmarried, living under one roof with a man who ain't kin." Owen crossed his arms. "They're free people, that may be, but freedom makes folks nervous." The sheriff gave no threat, just a warning. Then he rode off, leaving a trail of suspicion behind him. That evening, Owen told the women. Lee's jaw set. "They think we're his still," Myling nodded. Freedom always looks like danger to small minds than didn't speak. But later, when the wind picked up and the house settled into shadows, she sat beside Owen on the porch, cradling a blanket in her lap like it held all her memories. "I was never free," she said. "Not really. Kitchen to kitchen, hand to hand, always someone deciding what I was worth." He didn't look at her, just stared out into the wind. "Do you feel free now?" he asked. She thought for a long time. "I don't know," she whispered. "But I feel seen." In the distance, coyotes cried. The wind carried their song across the plains like a hymn. Owen closed his eyes and let the sound pass through him. Inside, Myling was lighting the lamp. Lee stirred something thick and fragrant on the stove, and for one flicker of a moment, the world felt like it was tilting toward grace. Rain came hard that Sunday morning. It wasn't the kind of drizzle that whispered against rooftops. It pounded the windows like judgment, the kind of storm folk said God sent when he was watching close. Thunder rolled low across the plains, not angry, just steady, like a drumbeat before a reckoning. Inside the cabin, the fire had gone out. The air smelled of damp cotton and boiled beans. Myling was wringing Owen's tunic by the hearth, while Lee dried her boots near the stove. Owen hadn't spoken much since sunrise. He sat at the table, sharpening his knife, the rasp of metal on stone the only voice in the room. And had stayed up late, baking biscuits, something sweet for once. The kitchen still smelled faintly of clove and burnt sugar, though no one had eaten much. There had been a knock before dawn. Not urgent, not loud, just polite enough to carry menace. Sheriff Brody stood outside with 2 others, his deputy and a man Owen didn't recognize, tall and thin with a mustache too neat for any honest work. Behind them waited a covered wagon, its top flapping in the wind. "Got some paperwork," the sheriff said. "You ought to read it." Owen didn't take it. "What's the charge?" "No charge," the stranger chimed in. "Just a matter of clarification. An ownership dispute. Technically speaking." Owen looked past him. "Thorn sent you." Thorn filed a claim. "Says these women were contractual bound to certain debts. He's willing to forgive them," the man added, his voice syrupy, "if they return voluntarily. We don't want trouble, Croft, just resolution." Lee stepped into the doorway. "We ain't contracts. We're people." The man tipped his hat but didn't meet her eyes. "Doesn't change the records. You think a bottle of whiskey and a laugh count as legal tender?" Myling asked from behind him. The man blinked. "We'll let the court decide that," and stayed inside, but she stood behind the window, her hands twisting in her apron, her breathing shallow and fast. Owen stepped down into the mud. "They're not going anywhere," the sheriff sighed. "Owen, don't make this harder. Town's talking. Church folks say it's immoral. 3 unmarried women sharing a home with a widowed man. You know how that sounds." "I know how it looks," Owen said, his voice like gravel. "Like decency. You're going to stir up trouble." "I didn't stir it. I sheltered it." The rain hit harder then, soaking through jackets, through hair, through hope. The sheriff muttered something Owen didn't catch, and the wagon turned without a word. They left the papers on the fence post, weighted with a stone. After they left, Myling read the documents in full. Her eye skimmed fast, lips tight. They're trying to scare us. Legal nonsense stitched together with threats. Lee lit a match off the stove and held it to the edge of the papers. Let him send more. The flames curled the parchment slowly. Myling watched until the last ash fell, but fear doesn't burn as easy. That afternoon, whispers turned into words. Townsfolk passing on the ranch road slowed their wagons. A boy threw a stone and ran. Someone painted an ugly slur on the water barrel with pig's blood. And found it first. She scrubbed until her knuckles bled. Agnes Reed arrived after sundown, soaked and out of breath. They're calling a council, she said, her voice shaking. Church elders, shopkeepers, all of them. They're meeting in the chapel tomorrow night. Going to decide whether you ought to stay. Whether they ought to. Myling didn't flinch. Let them. Lee looked at Owen. If we leave now, we can outrun the worst of it. Owen shook his head. You don't run from a fire you didn't start, and sat at the kitchen table, eyes wide, silent. That night, Owen walked the fence line with a lantern. The rain had stopped, but the wind lingered. He saw it then, a figure near the tree line, watching, a shape that slipped away before he could call out. He didn't chase, just stood there, heart slow, hand steady. They were testing him, testing them. The following evening, the chapel filled before the bell even rang. Owen arrived late, hat in hand, boots muddy, but back straight. He walked in alone. The room fell silent. At the front stood Reverend Miller, grey-bearded, sunken-eyed, his voice like dry leaves. Sheriff Brody sat near him. Thorne wasn't there, but his men were. Store owners, wives with pursed lips, boys with stones in their pockets. You're here to defend your conduct, Mr. Croft, the Reverend began. 3 women, no ceremony, no kinship, living under your roof. The Lord frowns on impropriety. Is kindness now improper? Owen asked. There are rules, there are people, he said. You all watched them get sold like meat. Not one of you stopped it. I did. The murmur rose. Someone scoffed. Someone said, sin. Owen raised his voice then, not loud, but clear. I never touched them. Never claimed them. Just gave them room to heal. That's more than this town ever gave. Myling stepped through the doorway then, her voice ringing across the pews. You talk about sin but turn your eyes from cruelty. You call us fallen, but we're the ones who crawled out. Lee followed. We built that ranch with work and silence. No man laid a hand on us. We're not your scandal. We're your shame then. And, trembling, entered last. She didn't speak. She just held out her hands, red, cracked, raw from scrubbing. This is what we do, Owen said when no one else would. We survive. Reverend Miller faltered. A few heads turned. Agnes Reed rose in the back row and spoke for the first time. I remember when none of you would sit near me, 'cause my boy was born too dark. I remember what silence cost me. Owen gave these girls what you'll never could. Peace. Someone tried to argue, but the words caught in their throat. After a long pause, the Reverend folded his paper. There will be no formal judgment. But don't expect welcome. Owen nodded once. We never asked for it. He walked out. The women followed. No one clapped. No one spat. Just silence, a different kind this time. Back at the ranch, the lamps were already lit. Lee opened the door. Myling set the kettle on. And swept the floor as if nothing had changed. But something had. Not everything needed to be declared out loud to be understood. That night, they sat on the porch together. No words, just breath and wind and the steady creak of the swing. The storm had passed, but the air still held the scent of thunder. Myling spoke once, just before bed. They saw us. Owen nodded. They did, and they didn't blink. Good, Lee said. Let their eyes sting for once. Annan, already halfway asleep in her chair, whispered, we didn't come here to be loved. just to be left in peace. They hadn't been welcomed, but they had not been run out either. Sometimes, in a town like that, it was enough to stay. The wind came back, not with a roar, but with a whisper, curling around the porch posts and eaves like a memory revisiting its home. It moved softly now, almost reverently, as if it, too, had been watching the little ranch with the same weary hope that hung between the rafters. Spring had crept in while no one was looking. The snow had melted weeks ago, but it was only now the land had begun to believe it. The earth outside the cabin was soft beneath Owen's boots. The fence line stood straighter these days. The porch didn't creak quite so sadly. The basil unplanted had sprouted green, reaching for sun with the same kind of quiet defiance she carried in her shoulders now. Lee had built a new pantry shelf, perfectly leveled, no nails left over. Myling had cleared out a space by the hearth where she read to Simon twice a week, her voice steady and warm. They had not been run out. They had not been embraced either. But they remained. And sometimes, survival is the most profound rebellion. Owen had taken to rising early again, not because the work demanded it, but because he wanted to see the morning begin. He liked the way the light caught on Anne's hair when she walked across the yard, the way Lee sang now when she thought no one could hear, and the way Myling sipped her coffee with one hand on her hip like a woman who'd chosen every inch of her own life. They did not speak of love, not aloud, but it crept in between gestures, coiled in the simple acts. A coat draped over shoulders before the night chill set in. A shelf built without request. Tea left steeping just the way Myling liked it, strong with honey. These things said more than declarations ever could. They were the language of people who had lost too much to gamble with words. Then, just when they'd begun to believe the worst had passed, Thorn returned. It happened fast. A scream from the barn, a flash of orange against the night sky. Lee burst through the front door, shouting, "He's here!" Owen didn't ask who. He already knew. The barn was alight, not fully engulfed, not yet, but flame licked the lower beams, hungry and spreading. Smoke poured upward like it had something to say. Thorn stood near the fence, a torch still in hand, his face twisted with fury and drink and whatever rot grew in men who lost power and couldn't bear it. "You stole them," he shouted over the fire's crackle. "Paraded them like saints while the whole town laughed at me." And clutched the porch post, trembling. Myling stepped forward. "Put it out," she said to Owen. "I'll keep her safe," but Lee was already running, bucket in hand, her hair whipping behind her like a banner. Owen followed, hauling water from the trough. They worked without speaking, sweat mixing with smoke, steam rising in clouds as they beat back the blaze. Twice, the flames roared high enough to blind them. Once, Lee slipped and gashed her knee open on a broken rake. She didn't stop. Inside the house, Myling held Anne close, pressing a wet cloth to her mouth to block the smoke that snuck in beneath the door. And whispered over and over, "Don't let him take us back, he won't," Myling said, steady. "Not while I breathe." When the last of the fire hissed into wet ash, Owen turned to find Thorn gone, but he hadn't vanished. The man had circled behind the house. Myling saw him first, the glint of a blade, the crazed eyes, the sharp, shaking breath of a man who'd convinced himself this was justice. He lunged toward Anne, and Owen was faster. He tackled Thorn into the dirt. Years of grief and grit and restraint poured out in every blow. The rage wasn't for this moment alone. It was for Martha, his wife who had died without dignity. For every girl who had no place but a backroom or a bargain. For every night this land swallowed sorrow without answer. Thorn bled, not fatally, just enough to remember he was flesh and fallible. Sheriff Brody arrived an hour later. Someone had seen the fire from town. No one asked questions this time. The sheriff took one look at Thorn, tied and gagged in the wagon bed, and said, "We'll be taking him far from here." No charges were filed against Owen. No sermons followed. Perhaps the town had finally learned to let silence rest in the right direction. The barn took damage, but it didn't fall. Lee rebuilt the doors by the next week. Myling taught Simon and 2 others how to read by lamplight. And began sketching with charcoal on flour sacks, soft portraits of hands and wildflowers. The ranch lived, and in time, so did they. Not as property, not as pity, but as people. On the first truly warm morning of the season, and stepped onto the porch in a clean cotton dress and whispered to no one in particular, "I don't flinch when I hear boots anymore," Lee answered from the yard, grinning. "That's 'cause yours are louder now," and Mai Ling, setting down her coffee, said, "Some scars stay. But they don't get the last word." Owen didn't say much. He just watched them, the way they moved through the space as if it were theirs, because it was. Whether they stayed a year or forever didn't matter. He had not rescued them. He had simply made room. That evening, as the sun folded itself into the western ridge, the four of them sat on the porch. No one rushed to speak. They just breathed, each one knowing that the worst had already come and passed. And still, they remained. The wind returned, gentle now. Not a storm, not a warning, just a witness. And if you ever ride past that stretch of prairie and see a porch lit with oil lamps and women laughing over fresh bread, tip your hat and keep riding. Not because you're unwelcome, but because peace doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just lives quietly in the places where grace was once made room to grow. That ranch will never be marked on maps. But the wind remembers.